This is a restricted area, lady. For service members. Not their dates. The words, slick with cheap beer and unearned confidence, were followed by a firm, dismissive shove. The crowd of young Marines, a boisterous sea of freshly cut hair and swagger, parted with a few sycophantic chuckles. In the center of their ignorant storm stood a woman, utterly still. She hadn't stumbled. She hadn't flinched. Her body, clad in simple gray slacks and a plain blue blouse that seemed a size too big, absorbed the impact as if it were nothing more than a passing breeze. She looked less like a threat and more like a weary civil servant who had taken a wrong turn on her way to the records department. Her hair was pulled back in a severe salt and pepper bun, revealing a face etched with the fine lines of someone who spent more time reading reports than worrying about skincare. But the grizzled Marine general who had just stepped onto the observation deck, overlooking the crowded bar, saw something else entirely. He saw her stance, a subtle, almost imperceptible alignment of the feet, a posture of perfect, relaxed balance that screamed decades of training on the pitching deck of a warship. He saw the absolute, profound calm in her posture, a stillness that was not passive, but predatory. The general felt a cold, knot of dread tighten in his stomach. He knew that stance. He knew that silence. And he knew the young, arrogant sergeant who had just laid hands on her was about to learn the most brutal and necessary lesson of his entire military career. The crowd laughed, but the general did not. He knew that laughter would soon die in their throats, replaced by a silence so complete it would feel like the vacuum of space. He watched as the woman slowly, deliberately, turned her head, her gaze not falling on the belligerent Marine, but past him, toward the large television screen mounted above the bar, her expression unreadable, her focus absolute. If you believe that true authority is proven not by the volume of a voice, but by the weight of one's actions, type competence below. The air in the Anchor and Eagle was thick with the familiar perfume of military life. Stale beer, industrial-grade cleaning solution, and the faint, briny tang of the nearby Pacific. It was a sanctuary, a place where the hierarchies of the outside world melted away, replaced by the simpler, more brutal meritocracy of reputation and bravado. Tonight, the dominant energy emanated from one Sergeant Rex, Rhino Corrigan, a Marine whose recent commendation for bravery in a minor border skirmish had inflated his ego to near-bursting proportions. He saw the woman, this quiet, unassuming fixture near the bar, as an anomaly, an unwelcome intrusion into his domain. Her silence was, to him, a sign of weakness, her plainness, an invitation for contempt. He and his coterie of junior Marines, all eager to emulate his aggressive confidence, had been growing louder, their laughter sharper, their presence expanding to fill every corner of the dimly lit room. The shove was merely the physical punctuation to a long paragraph of escalating disrespect. It was a gesture designed to assert dominance, to mark territory, to remind this civilian, this outsider, that she was on his ground. The woman's lack of reaction was, in itself, a defiance he could not comprehend. She simply stood there, her center of gravity seemingly anchored to the very core of the earth, her quiet gaze fixed on the muted news ticker scrolling across the bottom of the bar's main television. She was an island of tranquility in his manufactured tempest, and it infuriated him. The room watched, a captive audience to the unfolding drama. There were sailors, airmen, and other Marines, men and women who understood the unspoken rules. You don't challenge a decorated Marine sergeant in his favorite watering hole, especially not one with a reputation like Rhino Corrigan. So they watched, their silence a form of complicity, their faces a mixture of nervous anticipation and vicarious unease. They were waiting for the explosion, for the woman to cry out, to protest, to give Corrigan the reaction he so clearly craved. But never came. Instead, with a slowness that was almost hypnotic, she raised a hand, not in defense, but to signal the bartender, a nervous, fresh-faced sailor who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Her lips moved, but her voice was too low to be heard over the background din. A moment later, a glass of club soda with a lime wedge appeared before her. She placed a few dollars on the worn wooden surface, her movements economical and precise, her focus entirely on the simple transaction, as if the furious, red-faced sergeant standing inches away was nothing more than a piece of furniture. The sergeant, his face now a blotchy crimson mask of wounded pride, felt the tide of the room's attention turning from amusement to something closer to awkward pity. Her silence was a mirror, reflecting his own boorishness back at him, and he couldn't stand it. He needed to shatter that composure, to force a reaction that would justify his aggression. "What? Are you deaf now, too?" he snarled, stepping closer, invading her personal space. "I said this place is for people who've earned the right to be here. People who wear a uniform. You think because some officer bought you a drink you get to clog up the bar?" His voice dripped with condescension, painting a vulgar picture of her as a barracuda, a dependent trolling for a free meal and a moment of borrowed glory. He gestured vaguely around the room, at the framed photos of warships and the dusty unit plaques. "This is our place. We come here to get away from people like you. People who don't get it. You don't know what it costs. You don't know what it means." His tirade was a performance for his audience, a reaffirmation of his identity as a warrior, a gatekeeper of a sacred space. He was drawing a line in the sand, placing her firmly on the other side. The other patrons shifted uncomfortably. A few of the older non-commissioned officers exchanged weary glances. They had seen this 1,000 times. Young bucks, full of fire and convinced of their own immortality, mistaking arrogance for strength. They knew this was wrong, but the inertia of the crowd, the fear of becoming Corrigan's next target, kept them silent. They were bystanders in a crime of disrespect, their inaction a quiet endorsement. But the woman, the target of all this venom, seemed utterly unaffected. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her club soda, the clink of ice against the glass the only sound she contributed to the scene. Her eyes, a pale, piercing blue, remained fixed on the television screen. The news ticker continued its silent crawl. Reports on grain futures, a minor political scandal, updates on international shipping lanes. To anyone watching her, she appeared to be simply zoning out, ignoring the belligerent Marine as one might ignore a yapping dog. But a closer look, a more practiced eye, would have seen the subtle intensity of her focus. She wasn't just looking at the screen, she was processing it. Her mind, a vast and silent engine of strategic analysis, was absorbing the disparate data points, filing them away, connecting them to 1,000 other threads of information. The price of wheat in Eastern Europe, the transit time of a container ship through the Malacca Strait, the political instability in a sub-Saharan nation. To her, these were not random headlines. They were variables in a global equation she was constantly solving. Sergeant Corrigan's tantrum was, in the grand calculus of her world, a rounding error, a meaningless bit of static that was already fading into the background noise. Her stillness was not weakness. It was the ultimate expression of power, the calm that comes from operating on a level so far beyond her antagonist's comprehension that his actions were utterly, profoundly irrelevant. She was a mountain, and he was just wind howling against stone. The fragile bubble of the bar's self-contained drama was abruptly pierced by a sharp, electronic tone from the television, a sound that every service member in the room recognized instantly. It was the precursor to an emergency broadcast. The silent news ticker vanished, replaced by a stark, flashing red banner that read, "Fleet Advisory, live." The jovial din of the bar evaporated, replaced by a sudden, tomb-like silence. Every eye snapped to the screen. A news anchor, his face grim, appeared. "We are coming to you with breaking news from the South China Sea," he announced, his voice tight with gravity. "The Pentagon has just confirmed that a U.S. Navy Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, the USS Vance, has suffered what is being described as a catastrophic engineering casualty. The vessel is reportedly dead in the water, without power or propulsion, drifting in highly contested international waters." A map appeared on the screen, showing the Vance's last known position, a tiny blue icon in a vast expanse of ocean, perilously close to a dotted line marking the territorial claims of a rival nation. The anchor continued. "Naval experts are calling this a highly volatile situation. The Vance is one of our most advanced warships, but without power, she is a vulnerable target. The crew of over 300 sailors is, at this moment, adrift in one of the most dangerous maritime flashpoints on the planet. The mood in the Anchor and Eagle shifted instantly. The petty squabble at the bar was forgotten, replaced by a collective, professional concern. These were not just headlines to the men and women in this room. This was family. They knew what dead in the water truly meant. The loss of air conditioning and blistering heat, the failure of sanitation systems, the terrifying vulnerability of being a sitting duck. Sergeant Corrigan's bravado dissolved, his face paling as he grasped the tactical nightmare unfolding on the screen. His training kicked in, and he began to think in terms of threats and responses. There in the dragon's teeth, he muttered to one of his men, his earlier arrogance replaced by the focused anxiety of a professional warrior. That shipping lane is crawling with their maritime militia. They could have a fishing boat alongside an hour. The bar became a chorus of low, worried murmurs as the sailors and Marines processed the implications. They were all armchair quarterbacks, analyzing the situation based on their own slivers of experience. They need to get a carrier strike group spun up, one sailor said. Where's the Reagan? Another asked. Too far. Best they can do is scramble some P-8s from Okinawa for Overwatch, a third chimed in. Amidst this flurry of anxious speculation, the woman at the bar remained an island of calm. She had set her glass down with a soft, final click. Her posture, already straight, seemed to gain an unseen rigidity. Her gaze on the screen was no longer one of passive absorption. It was sharp, analytical, dissecting. She was not watching a news report. She was reading a battlefield. The map, the ship's class, the geographic location, the time of day. Her mind processed it all, not as a story, but as an operational problem set. The narrator could almost see the gears turning behind her pale blue eyes. A lifetime of command experience, of war games and real-world crises, activating. She was calculating drift rates, response times for assets in theater, rules of engagement, and the delicate, razor's-edge diplomacy required. The noise of the bar, the worried chatter, the frantic news anchor, it all faded away, replaced by the silent, swift, and lethal clarity of a commander assessing her board. The problem had been presented. Now, she would solve it. The bar manager, a retired Navy chief with 20 years of service under his belt, fumbled for the remote and cranked up the volume. The news broadcast cut to a live feed from a Pentagon briefing room. A rear admiral, a public affairs officer with a slick haircut and a deer-in-the-headlights expression, stood at a podium, fielding frantic questions from reporters. "We are aware of the situation and are monitoring it closely," he said, his voice a monotone of bureaucratic noncommitment. "We have full confidence in the crew of the USS Vance to manage the situation." The room groaned in collective frustration. It was official speak, a meaningless word salad designed to stall for time and project a sense of control that clearly didn't exist. Monitoring it? They're adrift, you moron, someone shouted at the screen. Sergeant Corrigan was pacing now, a caged tiger of righteous frustration. What are they waiting for? This is textbook. You establish a defensive perimeter, you get air cover on station, and you get a rescue and tow package moving yesterday. He was shouting at the television, his voice filled with the exasperation of the man on the ground who sees the solution so clearly, while the generals in their air-conditioned offices seemed paralyzed by indecision. He was not entirely wrong, but his solutions were blunt instruments, lacking the nuance and strategic foresight the situation demanded. He saw a tactical problem. He did not see the geopolitical chessboard on which it was playing out. Then, a new sound entered the cacophony of the room. It was a small, almost imperceptible series of clicks. The woman at the bar had opened her simple, unremarkable purse and retrieved a device that immediately silenced anyone who noticed it. It was not a smartphone. It was a small, brutally functional piece of hardware, encased in matte black, hardened polymer with a stubby, powerful antenna. It was an Iridium satellite phone, a military-grade piece of equipment reserved for individuals who needed to communicate from anywhere on the planet, under any conditions, on a secure network. The sight of it was a profound and jarring contradiction to her unassuming appearance. She pressed a single, large button on its side, and a small screen glowed to life. She held it to her ear, and when she spoke, her voice was not loud, but it possessed a quality of acoustic steel that cut through every other sound in the room. It was a voice honed by decades of speaking into radios and tactical networks, a voice that expected and received instant, unquestioning obedience. "This is Olympia," she said, her tone flat, devoid of emotion. A wave of confusion rippled through the few people who heard her clearly. Olympia was not a standard call sign. It was a flag-level designator, a name associated with the highest echelons of strategic command, a name whispered with a kind of mythic reverence. She listened for a fraction of a second, her expression unchanging. Then, she began to issue orders. "Negative on the carrier scramble," she stated, her words a direct, surgical refutation of Corrigan's shouted suggestion. "That's an unnecessary escalation. We will not give them a pretext." The authority in her voice was absolute. "I want the USS Stetham detached from Carrier Strike Group 5. They will break formation and proceed to the Vance's position at flank speed, maintaining fully missions control. I want them dark." She paused, listening to a confirmation she already knew was coming. "Task AP-8 Poseidon from Kadena Air Base for immediate ISR support, but they are to maintain a patrol track well outside the 12-mile limit. Loiter and report only. Do not paint any surface contacts." Another beat of silence. "Simultaneously, I want a dead stick tow package and a full engineering rapid response team, staged for airlift from Anderson Air Force Base on Guam. Have them on the flight line in 30 minutes. She was not asking. She was not suggesting. She was dictating the flow of events on a global scale from a bar stool in Coronado. Her final question was the sharpest of all. "Who is the commanding officer on the Vance?" She listened. "Commander Wallace. Get him on this net." Now Sergeant Corrigan had frozen mid-pace, his mouth agape. Every word she spoke was a thunderclap of cognitive dissonance. He understood the terminology, the acronyms, the chilling efficiency of her commands. This was not some armchair general. This was not a theory. This was the real thing. This was the voice of ultimate command, and it was coming from the quiet, unassuming woman he had just physically shoved and verbally assaulted. A tinny, respectful voice crackled faintly from the sat phone's earpiece, just loud enough for him to hear. "Yes, ma'am. Patching you through to the Vance now. Stand by." Just as the last tinny word from the sat phone faded, the heavy double oak doors of the Anchor and Eagle swung inward with a force that made them bang against their stoppers. The sudden noise, a percussive clap in the otherwise spellbound silence of the bar, drew every eye to the entrance. Silhouetted against the fading amber light of the evening was a figure that commanded instant recognition and deference. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore the dress blue uniform of a United States Marine Corps general, the 4 silver stars on his collar glinting like distant, cold constellations. It was General Marcus Thorne, the commander of all Marine Corps forces in the Pacific, a man whose reputation was forged in the fires of Fallujah and the mountains of Afghanistan. He was a living legend, a warrior scholar whose presence alone could change the atmospheric pressure of a room. He was supposed to be the guest of honor at a formal diplomatic dinner across the base, but a single, frantic call from his aide about a Priority 1 situation at the A&E had sent him here, his gut churning with a nameless dread. His sharp, predatory eyes, accustomed to scanning horizons for threats, swept the room in a single, comprehensive glance. He took in the scene with the speed of a battlefield assessment. The stunned, frozen faces of dozens of sailors and Marines, the blaring television screen showing the Pentagon briefing, the pale, shell-shocked visage of one of his own sergeants, Rhino Corrigan, standing like a statue in the middle of the floor. And then his gaze landed on the woman. He saw her sitting on a simple bar stool, the military-grade sat phone held to her ear, her back ramrod straight. He heard her voice, low and clear in the preternatural quiet. "Wallace, this is Olympia. Give me a sit rep on your primary coolant loop. I need to know the risk of thermal runaway in the secondary pump system." Acknowledge. General Thorne felt the blood drain from his face. He saw her, not as the others did, not as a civilian, not as an unassuming woman in plain clothes, but as who and what she truly was. He saw the commander, United States Pacific Fleet, casually diagnosing a potential reactor coolant failure on a billion-dollar warship from a dive bar, with more accuracy and calm than the entire engineering staff at NAVSEA. He understood, in that single, horrifying instant, the entire narrative of the last 10 minutes. He saw the arrogant sergeant, The disrespectful shove, the public humiliation. He saw the crisis, and he saw her effortless, silent assumption of command. The general, a man who had not felt fear in decades, felt a cold, terrifying wave of it now. Not for himself, but for the profound, catastrophic breach of protocol and respect that had occurred in this room, on his watch. He knew her call sign. He knew who Olympia was. And he knew that the universe of one of his young, promising Marines was about to be torn from its foundations. He started moving, his polished black shoes making no sound on the beer-sticky floor, his every step a deliberate, measured advance toward the epicenter of the silent storm. General Marcus Thorne closed the distance to the bar in 3 long, purposeful strides. The air seemed to part before him. He came to a halt exactly 6 feet from the woman on the stool, assuming the formal position of one addressing a superior officer. He stood there, a 4-star general at a perfect, respectful parade rest, and waited. He did not speak. He did not interrupt. He simply waited for his commander to finish her work. On the stool, the woman listened intently to the voice on the other end of the line, the voice of the Vance's commanding officer, Commander Wallace, reporting directly from the heart of the crisis miles away across the Pacific. "Understood, Wallace," she finally said, her voice a balm of pure, calming authority. "Your engineers have done well to contain it. The Stetham is en route to your position to provide a defensive screen, ETA 6 hours. A full tow and repair package is being flown from Guam. Your only job now is to keep your crew safe and hold your station. I will be monitoring your progress directly." Olympia, out. She pressed the button on the side of the sat phone, and the small screen went dark. With a quiet, final click, the link that had stretched across the ocean, bypassing chains of command and bureaucratic red tape to connect the mind of the commander directly to the tip of the spear, was severed. She placed the device on the bar with the same deliberate care she might place a piece on a chessboard. Then, and only then, did she turn her head, her calm, pale blue eyes rising to meet the intense gaze of the Marine general standing before her. For a heartbeat, the room witnessed a silent, profound exchange between 2 of the most powerful military leaders on the planet. There was no rank in that look, no protocol, only a shared understanding of duty, of crisis, and of the lonely burden of command. Then, the moment passed, and the rigid structure of the military world snapped back into place like a steel trap. General Thorne's body went rigid. His back, already straight, became a steel rod. His right hand, scarred and powerful, shot up to the brim of his cover in a salute so crisp, so violently precise, that it seemed to create its own sound, a whip crack in the dead air. "Admiral Rostova," he boomed, his voice a low, gravelly thunder that vibrated through the floorboards and rattled the glasses behind the bar. "Ma'am," the word, the title, detonated in the room. Admiral, not a commander, not a captain, an admiral. The 4 stars on her invisible collar suddenly burned brighter than the 4 on his visible one. The collective gasp of the room was audible. Sergeant Corrigan swayed on his feet as if he'd been shot. General Thorne held the salute, his arm locked, his eyes fixed on hers, a public and undeniable display of absolute deference. After a long moment, Admiral Rostova gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. The general lowered his hand with the same precision he had raised it. Then, he turned his head slowly, a predator turning on its prey, and his eyes, now chips of glacial ice, pinned Sergeant Rex Corrigan to the floor. The general's voice dropped, losing its thunderous volume, but gaining a lethal, focused intensity. "Sergeant," he said, the word a sliver of ice, "do you have any idea who you were standing in the presence of?" He didn't wait for an answer. "That," he said, gesturing with his chin toward the unassuming woman on the stool, "is Admiral Eva Rostova. She is the commander of the United States Pacific Fleet. She commands every ship, every sailor, and every Marine in this entire hemisphere. Her authority extends from the coast of California to the Horn of Africa. She commands you. She commands me." He let the devastating truth settle into the horrified silence. He took a step toward the ashen-faced sergeant. "And you," the general whispered, his voice a venomous hiss, "put your hands on her." He stopped, leaving the accusation hanging in the air like a death sentence. "Explain yourself." By the time the sun rose over the naval base the next morning, the story was already legend. It didn't spread through official channels or morning briefings. It moved with the organic, unstoppable speed of barracks gossip, a viral tale of hubris and vindication. It was dubbed the shove at the anchor, or more simply, the Admiral's perch. It was told in hushed tones on the mess decks of the ships in port, whispered in the maintenance bays of the aviation squadrons, and debated in the chow halls where young Marines gathered. As with all great sea stories, the details were quickly burnished by imagination. Some versions claimed Admiral Rostova had thrown the sergeant across the room with a single touch. Others swore that General Thorne had stripped Corrigan of his stripes on the spot and had him dragged away in chains. The reality, as is often the case, was far quieter and infinitely more devastating. After her quiet dismissal of the general, it's handled Marcus. See to your man. Admiral Rostova had simply picked up her purse, left a $10 bill on the bar to cover her club soda, and a generous tip for the terrified bartender, and walked out into the night. She didn't look back. Her part in the drama was over. The problem of the USS Vance was under control, and the secondary problem of the sergeant was now a leadership challenge for the Marine Corps to solve. She had no interest in punishment. Punishment was easy. Education was hard. General Thorne, understanding this implicitly, had not berated Sergeant Corrigan in the bar. He had simply given him a single, cold order. My office. 0600. Be there. Corrigan's night was a sleepless hell of his own making, the scene replaying in his mind in a torturous loop. The next morning, standing at rigid attention on the plush carpet of the general's immaculate office, he had braced for the end of his career. But the general didn't shout. He didn't threaten a court-martial. He spoke in a low, disappointed tone that was far worse than any tirade. The conversation wasn't about the catastrophic disrespect to a superior officer. Thorne knew that was a symptom, not the disease. The conversation was about perception. You looked at one of the most powerful and intelligent human beings on this continent, and you saw nothing, the general said, his voice laced with cold contempt. You saw a woman, you saw a civilian, you saw a target for your ego. You did not see a commander. A warrior's greatest weapon is his eyes, Sergeant, not his rifle. His ability to see the world as it is, not as his prejudices want it to be. Your eyes failed you. You failed the most basic test of a leader. Corrigan's punishment was a stroke of leadership genius. He was not sent to the break. He was not busted down in rank. He was, by order of the general, temporarily reassigned for 30 days of protocol and observational duty directly to the staff of the Commander, Pacific Fleet. He would have to report to Admiral Rostova's headquarters every morning. He would have to see her. He would have to face the quiet, living embodiment of his failure every single day. It was not a punishment to break his body, but a lesson designed to rebuild his soul. Sergeant Corrigan's 30 days on the Admiral's staff were a slow, agonizing education in humility. He was a ghost in a machine of global power, a silent observer in a world he never knew existed. His duties were menial, designed to reinforce his new, lowly position in the grand scheme of things. He carried briefing books. He stood watch outside conference rooms. He was a piece of furniture in the antechamber of history. From this vantage point, he saw Admiral Eva Rostova not as the quiet woman from the bar, but as the strategic titan she was. He watched her conduct a video teleconference with the South Korean chief of naval operations, discussing submarine patrol schedules with an easy, collegial authority. He saw her stand before a bank of screens in the Fleet Operations Center, her mind effortlessly juggling the logistics of a multinational naval exercise involving 5 different countries and over 50 warships. She moved pieces around a map the size of the world with the calm precision of a grandmaster playing chess. He witnessed her take a call in the middle of a high-level strategy session, and her entire demeanor softened as she spoke to the young widow of a sailor lost in a training accident, her voice filled with a genuine, aching empathy that cut through her stern exterior. He learned that her silence, which he had mistaken for weakness, was in fact her greatest weapon. She listened more than she spoke. In high-stakes meetings with politicians and defense contractors, she would sit perfectly still, her eyes missing nothing, allowing others to talk, to posture, to reveal their agendas and their weaknesses. Then, after long periods of silence, she would ask a single, quiet question so incisive, so perfectly aimed, that would cut to the absolute heart of the matter and end the debate. Her power was not in volume, but in precision. The loud, arrogant, swaggering Marine who had walked into the Anchor and Eagle a month prior was slowly being eroded, worn down by the quiet, relentless competence of the woman he had wronged. In his place, a more thoughtful, more observant man was beginning to take shape. On the 30th and final day of his humiliating assignment, he found his chance. She was working late, alone in her vast, Spartan office, reviewing intelligence summaries. He knocked tentatively on the doorframe. "Mom." She looked up, her blue eyes clear and patient, showing no sign of their last encounter. "Sergeant," she acknowledged. He stepped into the room, snapping to a rigid brace. His heart hammered against his ribs. "Ma'am," he began, his voice cracking slightly. I want to apologize. For my conduct at the bar. There was no excuse for my actions, for my words. I was unprofessional. I was wrong. I am sorry." He stood there, his confession hanging in the quiet office, expecting a reprimand, a dismissal, anything. Admiral Rostova regarded him for a long, silent moment, her gaze analytical. She wasn't looking at a subordinate who had wronged her. She was assessing a soldier who had been through a crucible. Finally, she spoke, her voice even and calm, the voice of a teacher, not a disciplinarian. "The most dangerous weapon on any battlefield, Sergeant Corrigan," she said, "is an assumption. It will get you killed faster than any bullet." She leaned forward slightly. "You assumed I was weak because I was a woman in civilian clothes. You assumed I was insignificant because I was quiet and alone. You assumed my purpose was to serve your ego. Your assumptions were your enemy that night. They blinded you. Do not ever let them blind you again." She held his gaze for another second, letting the lesson sink in. Then she nodded, a gesture of finality. "Your temporary duty is complete. You are dismissed, Sergeant." He executed a flawless about-face and walked out of her office. The weight of a mountain lifted from his shoulders, replaced by the foundation of a lesson that would define the rest of his life. That weekend, a small, unofficially engraved brass plate appeared on the back of the stool where she had sat in the Anchor and Eagle. It read, "The Admiral's Perch. Never assume." A year later, the physical brass plate on the bar stool was only a small reflection of the deeper legacy left by that single evening. The story of Admiral Rostova and the chastened sergeant had become institutional folklore, a modern parable passed down from seasoned NCOs to boots fresh off the bus at Naval Base Coronado. It was a cautionary tale, not about the consequences of disrespecting a flag officer, but about the mortal sin of making assumptions. It became a teaching tool, a shorthand for the idea that true strength is often hidden in plain sight, and that the quietest person in the room is the one you should be watching most closely. The story's protagonist, Sergeant Rex Corrigan, was now Staff Sergeant Corrigan. He had not only survived his monumental blunder, he had been forged by it. The general's unconventional punishment had worked exactly as intended. Corrigan was now widely regarded as one of the most effective and respected squad leaders in his battalion. The Rhino persona was gone, replaced by a leader known not for his volume, but for his perception. He mentored his young Marines with a quiet intensity, relentlessly drilling into them the importance of observation, situational awareness, and humility. He taught them to measure a person not by their uniform, their gender, or their rank, but by the quiet confidence of their bearing and the undeniable evidence of their competence. He would frequently take his new squad members to the Anchor and Eagle, not for a celebratory drink, but for a history lesson. He would lead them to the roped-off stool with its gleaming brass plate, and he would tell them the story. He never softened his own role. In his telling, he was the arrogant fool, the cautionary figure, the embodiment of everything a Marine NCO should not be. By publicly owning his greatest shame, he transformed it into his most powerful leadership tool, earning a level of respect from his men that his previous, swaggering self could never have imagined. The ripple effect was palpable across the base. Junior officers learned to listen more carefully to their senior, enlisted advisors. NCOs began to see mentoring as more than just shouting and corrective training. The incident created a subtle but powerful cultural shift, a renewed appreciation for the archetype of the quiet professional, the unassuming expert whose worth is proven by action, not assertion. Admiral Rostova, in her silent, unflappable response to a moment of blatant disrespect, had done more to reinforce the core values of the service than 1,000 mandatory training presentations. Her true legacy wasn't in the operational orders she gave that night, but in the thousands of minds she inadvertently changed, a quiet revolution of perspective that spread from one life to the next. Years passed. Admiral Eva Rostova eventually retired, her 4 stars folded and presented to her in a quiet ceremony, her name added to the long, distinguished list of leaders who had stood the watch. In the official annals of naval history, her career was defined by major strategic shifts, technological innovations, and the successful navigation of a dozen geopolitical crises. The incident with the USS Vance was recorded as a minor footnote, a testament to her command team's efficiency in defusing a situation before it could escalate into a major international incident. The story of what happened in the Anchor and Eagle, however, was never recorded in any official document. It didn't need to be. It lived on in a place far more enduring, in the culture. It became a foundational myth for a new generation of sailors and Marines, a story told on long deployments in the middle of the ocean, in ready rooms before flight ops, and in dusty motor pools on the eve of field exercises. The legend of the Admiral's Perch endured because its power was not derived from the rank of the protagonist, but from the universality of its theme. It was a stark and powerful reminder that true strength requires no announcement. It is not posture, it does not boast, and it certainly does not seek validation from the ignorant. True strength is quiet, it is observant, it is patient, and it reveals itself not in words of self-aggrandizement, but in moments of decisive, competent action. The story taught a simple, profound lesson. The person you are most tempted to underestimate is often the very person from whom you have the most to learn. The quietest individual in the room is frequently the most powerful. On the other side of the country, a newly promoted gunnery sergeant Corrigan, now a grizzled veteran with more salt on his uniform than most recruits had seen in their lives, was preparing a group of newly commissioned second lieutenants for their first fleet deployment. As his final lesson learned, he gathered them around and told them a story. He told them about a loud, arrogant young sergeant in a bar and a quiet, unassuming woman he had mistaken for a nobody. He told them about the shove, the insults, and the world-altering silence that followed. He finished the story, his voice thick with the emotion of a 2-decade-old memory that still felt as fresh as yesterday. "I shoved an admiral because I thought she was just a woman," he said, his gaze meeting the eyes of each young officer. "She didn't shove me back. She didn't have me arrested. She just wanted to work. And in her silence, she taught me everything I would ever need to know about leadership, respect, and the absolute folly of assumption. True legacy isn't what you shout for the world to hear. It's the echo you leave in the quiet, changed hearts of others." For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud ignorance, and where professional silence defines ultimate worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Tales.